In our previous IMF World Bank Group primer episode, we talked about some basics and hinted at their current directions. We will now be talking about the present trajectories. We face multiple crises today: an economic crisis accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the health crisis itself, and the climate crisis. In this context, social movements and concerned organizations argue that the IMF World Bank Group's current directions continue to prioritize a neoliberal agenda. First, let us talk about the rhetoric of recovery. In April 2021, the World Bank Group introduced GRID. The promises of this approach are in its name: a green, resilient, and inclusive development that, for the World Bank Group, responds to the problem of climate crisis, inequalities, and even debts. But without changing the main policy and programmatic direction of the IMF World Bank Group, the promotion of the role of finance capital and big private sector, one should take a closer look. With the corporate recovery, would it green just mean greenwashing instead? Especially as corporate plunder and neoliberal extraction of mineral, agricultural, and energy resources continue in the name of channeling investment to developing countries. With profit as the continuing motive, wouldn't inclusivity claims and a sudden focus on social protection from the World Bank Group just distract from its policies that exacerbate inequalities? And without ending neoliberal assumptions, wouldn't appeals to resilience just mean avoiding the roots of crisis, which in developing countries consists of exploitative and some might say neo-colonial relations? Second, we have to talk about debt amid the pandemic. The IMF World Bank Group offers indebted countries around $250 billion in loans supporting COVID response. But many issues remain. In the first place, debt by its nature as a form of financing requires governments to pay lenders back, possibly at the expense of spending on social services and public goods. Usually, governments raise money for these payments by imposing more taxes on the people. Loan conditionalities have not ended. They took new names, now under development policy financing arrangements, which are driving pro-corporate reforms in the global south, such as in the Philippines and Indonesia. What about just forgiving the debts altogether, or canceling them? The World Bank Group refuses canceling debts owed to it, only offering payment suspensions for certain developing countries and for a limited period. The IMF only pushes countries to negotiate with powerful private creditors to alter the terms of the debt and of continued repayment. As developing countries burn through their meager resources to alleviate the worsening global pandemic, debt payments continue. Third, how are current World Bank Group directions related to the drive to vaccinate the people as part of a bigger health-based response? The World Bank Group refuses any concessions that could temper transnational corporations' monopoly power over vaccines. The bank has spoken against ongoing demands to waive neoliberal trade rules, particularly the trade-related aspects in intellectual property rights agreement. In reality, the rules themselves have barred southern countries from the means to create and produce their own vaccines and maximize current technologies for economic development. The World Bank Group's position reinforces corporate control of vaccine technologies. It protects a key source of pharmaceutical corporations' profits at the expense of the people's right to health and pandemic needs. That is a lot to process and could be alarming to some, but we won't end there. Alongside the history of the IMF World Bank Group is a history of people's resistance. From Argentina, the Philippines, to Lebanon, and across the world. Most importantly, what can we do? We should launch and join mass campaigns that advance people-led development and international solidarity. Workers, peasants, indigenous peoples, women, and other sectors could resist the IMF World Bank Group at the national level through opposing harmful projects and policies, and even at the international level. For movements, we could further broaden our organizing, awareness raising, and alliances against neoliberalism and monopoly capitalism, launching more effective coordinated mass campaigns means reaching a broad range of the economic groups and sectors usually affected by the damaging effects of neoliberalism, who could be roused into action. Another important task is to forge and strengthen alliances between peoples from the global north and south. For civil society, policy advocacy and lobbying should complement people's campaigns and demands. Mass campaigns can utilize these in order to serve their bigger primary objectives. For CSOs engaging in official processes, supporting movements could take the form of seeking accountability and compelling the adoption or implementation of rights-based standards and principles. In the end, the strength lies in our people's organizations in collective action. Victories would further suggest lessons for other social movements and show that it is vital to put people over profit.